The recent earthquakes in the Sierra are a great reminder of California's other very active earthquake zone. Now, when you think about earthquakes, you're probably thinking about earthquakes along the San Andreas Fault.
Powerful 7.0 magnitude earthquake that rocked Northern California and triggered a tsunami warning today.
A powerful disaster may be looming beneath California. The San Andreas Fault, a massive crack slicing through the state, has long been feared for its ability to unleash devastating earthquakes. But what if the next big rupture triggers something even worse? Scientists warn that the fault's instability could set off a catastrophic tsunami, reshaping entire coastlines in an instant. With recent earthquakes rattling San Bernardino and California overdue for a massive quake, how much longer can the fault hold? The signs are building, and experts are watching closely. Could the recent tremors be a warning of what's to come? Recent earthquakes and growing concerns. Imagine waking up to the ground shifting beneath you, a deep, unsettling rumble shaking the walls, rattling your windows and setting off a chorus of car alarms outside. That's exactly what happened in San Bernardino, California, when two back-to-back earthquakes struck in the early hours of the morning, just this Monday. The first hit at exactly 9:44, registering a magnitude of 3.5. 4 minutes later, another tremor followed, slightly weaker at 3.0. For a state used to seismic activity, this wasn't exactly a record-breaking event, but something about it felt off. The quakes were centered just a few miles north of San Bernardino, their depths stretching more than 4 miles underground. No major damage was reported, and thankfully no one was hurt. But that didn't stop people from noticing. Residents in Inglewood, Redondo Beach, Palm Springs, and even North San Diego County all felt it. Some took to social media posting things like, "Felt both, just another day in California." Others shrugged it off with a mix of humor and resignation. But beneath the jokes, there was an unspoken question hanging in the air. Was this just another routine tremor, or was it a warning sign of something much bigger? California, after all, is no stranger to earthquakes. It sits directly on the San Andreas Fault, a massive geological boundary that marks the meeting point of two enormous tectonic plates, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate. These plates are constantly in motion, grinding against each other at an excruciatingly slow pace. Most of the time, this movement is harmless, but every once in a while, the stress between them becomes too much, and the fault gives way in the form of a powerful earthquake. The problem? Scientists say this fault has been holding back a massive amount of stress for decades, and when it finally gives, the results could be catastrophic. The recent quakes in San Bernardino were small, yes, but they happened along the very fault line that experts have been watching like hawks, and they weren't the only ones. In January alone, California was hit with 4 earthquakes in just 24 hours. 1 tremor? Normal. 2? Fine. But 4? That's when you start to wonder if the Earth is trying to send a message. The real fear isn't about these smaller quakes themselves, but about what they could be leading up to. Scientists have been saying for years that the West Coast is overdue for what's known as the Big One, a massive earthquake measuring magnitude 8 or higher. That's not just a big earthquake, that's a life-altering disaster. According to estimates from the Great California Shakeout, a quake of that size could cause around 1,800 deaths, at least 50,000 injuries, and a staggering $200 billion in damage. And here's where things get really unsettling. Scientists say both the northern and southern sections of the San Andreas Fault have an equal chance of generating a high-magnitude earthquake in the next few decades. That means whether it's Los Angeles or San Francisco, at least one major urban center is in the direct path of destruction. So what does all this mean? Are these recent quakes just another reminder that California lives on shaky ground? Or are they warning tremors signaling something much worse? One thing is for sure, the San Andreas Fault is a ticking time bomb. But how exactly does it work? What makes this fault line so dangerous compared to others? The San Andreas Fault and its history. The San Andreas Fault is more than just a crack in the ground. It is one of the most studied and feared fault lines in the world, a massive fracture in the Earth's crust that stretches for nearly 800 miles across California. But here's what makes it truly dangerous. It is not just any fault. It is a strike-slip fault, meaning the two sides of the fracture are grinding past each other horizontally rather than one slipping over the other. This type of movement may sound less destructive than faults that push land upwards, but it actually makes the San Andreas incredibly volatile. To understand why, you have to go back in time. The story of the San Andreas Fault begins 30 million years ago, when the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate first met. These two colossal slabs of Earth's crust were never supposed to be friendly neighbors. The Pacific Plate was moving northwest, while the North American Plate was creeping in the opposite direction. The friction between them created enormous pressure, and that pressure needed somewhere to go. So like a crack forming in glass, the San Andreas Fault was born. For millions of years, the plates continued their slow-motion battle. Each year, they move roughly the same distance as your fingernails grow, about 2 inches. That may not sound like much, but over time, it adds up. The accumulated strain builds until the rocks along the fault can no longer hold it in, and then, snap. The plates lurch forward in a violent, sudden motion, releasing seismic energy that we feel as an earthquake. Some of the most infamous earthquakes in history have come from the San Andreas Fault. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 is one of the most devastating examples. At magnitude 7.9, it wasn't just an earthquake. It was an urban catastrophe. Buildings collapsed and over 3,000 people lost their lives. This was the moment that cemented the San Andreas Fault's reputation as a force to be feared. Then there was the Fort Tejon earthquake of 1857. While lesser known, this quake actually ruptured a much longer stretch of the fault than the 1906 disaster. The shaking was so intense that trees were uprooted, the ground cracked open, and rivers even changed course. If a similar quake were to strike today, experts estimate it would cause unimaginable destruction, especially with California's massive population centers sitting right on the fault line. And here's the part that should make anyone uneasy. The fault is not just dangerous because of its history, but because of its pattern. Earthquakes along the San Andreas Fault tend to happen in cycles, and those cycles suggest that we are overdue for a massive rupture. Scientists have discovered evidence of past earthquakes by digging trenches along the fault and analyzing sediment layers. What they found was alarming. Over the past 1,200 years, major quakes have struck along the southern section of the fault, roughly every 175 to 200 years. The last major rupture, 1857. That means the fault is now more than 50 years past due for another massive earthquake. And while smaller quakes, like the recent ones in San Bernardino, relieve some of the built-up tension, they are nowhere near enough to prevent the big one. The fault is locked, meaning stress is accumulating with no release. When it finally snaps, it could set off a domino effect, triggering other nearby faults, amplifying the destruction, and potentially leading to a multi-fault rupture, something scientists have only recently begun to understand. But earthquakes aren't the only danger. The land around the fault is physically shifting over time. If you were to stand on one side of the San Andreas Fault and your friend stood on the other, you would both be moving in opposite directions, just very, very slowly. The city of Los Angeles, which sits on the Pacific Plate, is actually creeping closer to San Francisco at a rate of 2 inches per year. In several million years, Los Angeles and San Francisco will literally be next-door neighbors. While that might sound like a fascinating geological quirk, it also means that massive stress is constantly building between the plates, pushing the fault closer to its breaking point. Adding to the concern, some sections of the fault are creeping while others are completely stuck. Scientists have identified a particularly concerning area, the locked segment running through Southern California. This section has been eerily silent for far too long. It has not experienced a major rupture in centuries, meaning an enormous amount of stress has been trapped underground. When it finally moves, it won't be a minor shake. It will be a violent, landscape-altering disaster. And this brings us to a terrifying possibility. What if the next rupture doesn't just cause shaking, but triggers something much bigger? How the fault triggers earthquakes. The San Andreas Fault is like a wound in the Earth's crust, but instead of healing, it gets worse with time. Deep beneath the surface, immense forces are at work, silent, invisible, and completely unstoppable. It is here along the grinding boundary between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate that earthquakes are born. But how exactly does this fault trigger earthquakes? And more importantly, why do scientists believe the next one will be catastrophic? To understand this, imagine the Earth's crust as a giant puzzle made of rigid pieces called tectonic plates. These plates are constantly shifting, moving just inches every year. Normally, this movement is slow and steady, but the problem with the San Andreas Fault is that parts of it are stuck. Friction holds the plates in place, preventing them from sliding smoothly. But while the plates may not be moving at the surface, the energy beneath them is still building. It is like pulling back a slingshot. Tension increases until the resistance gives out, and when it does, the plates lurch forward in a violent motion. This is what we feel as an earthquake. The San Andreas Fault is particularly dangerous because of its strike-slip nature. Instead of one plate diving under the other, like in a subduction zone, these plates slide past each other horizontally. This sideways movement can be incredibly destructive, because instead of energy dissipating into the deep ocean or uninhabited areas, it is released right under California's most populated cities. And here's where things get even worse. Earthquakes along the San Andreas Fault do not happen in just one place. When a rupture begins, it can unzip the fault like a broken seam, spreading along its length in seconds. The more the fault that ruptures, the bigger the earthquake. Scientists have found evidence that during some past earthquakes, this chain reaction has allowed tremors to spread over hundreds of miles. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake is a prime example. The rupture started northwest of the city, but quickly spread along nearly 300 miles of the fault, turning what might have been a localized disaster into a statewide catastrophe. More concerning is the possibility of multi-fault ruptures. Most people think of earthquakes as a single break in the ground, but the reality is much more chaotic. California's landscape is laced with a network of faults, many of which are connected in ways scientists are still trying to understand. If the San Andreas ruptures in just the right way, it could set off a domino effect, triggering multiple nearby faults at once. This scenario would dramatically increase the strength of the quake, shaking areas far beyond the expected impact zone. And when it comes to the San Andreas, location matters. The fault runs through both rural and heavily populated regions. If a major rupture starts in a remote area like the Carrizo Plain, the shaking could be strong but less destructive. But if it starts closer to a city, Los Angeles, San Francisco, or even the Inland Empire, the damage could be catastrophic. One of the biggest concerns is directivity pulses. These occur when an earthquake rupture moves in the same direction as the fault itself, sending seismic energy forward in a powerful wave. Think of it like a speeding car kicking up a dust cloud. The faster the rupture moves, the more intense the shaking at the front of the wave. This is bad news for places like Los Angeles, which sits right in the path of a potential rupture along the southern section of the fault. And this brings us to one of the scariest possibilities: a full-length rupture of the San Andreas Fault. In simulations, geologists have modeled what would happen if the fault were to break from end to end, from the Salton Sea in the south all the way up to Cape Mendocino in the north. The results? Utter devastation. A magnitude 8 or higher earthquake could cause violent shaking for several minutes, damaging infrastructure across the entire state. Bridges could collapse, highways could split open, and entire neighborhoods could be reduced to rubble. But the worst part? It would not be over when the shaking stops. Major earthquakes on strike-slip faults can trigger severe aftershocks, some nearly as large as the main quake itself. After the 1857 Fort Tejon earthquake, powerful aftershocks continued for months, adding to the destruction. The same happened after the 1994 Northridge earthquake, when an aftershock nearly collapsed an already weakened freeway. If the big one were to strike today, aftershocks could cripple rescue efforts, making an already dire situation even worse. And then there's the risk of liquefaction. This occurs when strong shaking turns solid ground into something more like quicksand. In areas with loose, water-saturated soil, like much of the Los Angeles basin, entire buildings could sink into the ground, tilting and collapsing as the earth beneath them shifts. And here's something most people don't think about: fires. Some of the deadliest earthquakes in history were not just destructive because of the shaking, but because of the infernos that followed. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake is a perfect example. The quake itself caused massive destruction, but it was the uncontrollable fires that truly wiped out the city. Gas lines ruptured, electrical wires sparked, and entire neighborhoods burned for days. If a similar earthquake were to strike Los Angeles or San Francisco today, the same nightmare scenario could unfold. Now let's talk about something even more terrifying: the silent sections of the San Andreas Fault. While some parts of the fault experience frequent smaller quakes that release pressure, other sections have remained locked for centuries. These are the areas that worry scientists the most. They are storing immense amounts of energy, and when they finally rupture, they could release one of the most violent earthquakes in recorded history. But what if an earthquake along the San Andreas Fault isn't just about land movement? What if it shakes something even bigger? What if it disturbs the ocean itself? Tsunamis and other catastrophic risks. When you hear the word tsunami, your mind might immediately jump to images of massive waves crashing into the shorelines of Southeast Asia or Japan. These enormous walls of water are often triggered by underwater earthquakes, but the terrifying reality is that California is just as vulnerable to such a disaster. The San Andreas Fault, while famous for generating massive earthquakes, could also be the catalyst for a devastating tsunami. It's important to understand how this could happen and why it's a possibility we can no longer ignore. Tsunamis are not simply caused by earthquakes. They require a specific type of seismic event, one that causes the ocean floor to displace vertically in a significant way. But when we look at California's situation, there's one key factor that could lead to a perfect storm: the fault's proximity to the Pacific Ocean. The San Andreas Fault runs through the length of California, stretching from the Gulf of California in the south to Northern California, very close to the coast. When a major rupture occurs, it could cause a sudden displacement of land that is close enough to the sea to disrupt the ocean surface. Imagine the ocean floor moving vertically by several feet or more during a large earthquake. This could set off a tsunami wave, sending powerful water surges toward coastal cities, including Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego. While most tsunamis are triggered by submarine earthquakes, which occur when tectonic plates shift beneath the ocean, land-based earthquakes along the San Andreas could still have a massive impact on the coastline. The fault is not underwater, but if the earthquake causes a landmass to suddenly shift, it could trigger landslides that displace water, potentially creating a wave large enough to flood coastal areas. The real danger lies in the speed at which such waves travel. Tsunami waves, once generated, can move across the ocean at speeds of over 500 miles per hour. This means that if a massive earthquake strikes along the San Andreas Fault, coastal communities may have just a few minutes to react before the waves arrive. In places like Los Angeles and San Francisco, where millions of people live and work near the coast, the damage could be catastrophic. Tsunamis are not the only risk from a massive earthquake along the San Andreas Fault. In fact, there are multiple interconnected hazards that could cause widespread destruction. Let's take a look at some of the most immediate and devastating impacts that a magnitude 8 earthquake could cause across California. A big threat to coastal cities comes from tsunami-induced flooding. While the initial waves of a tsunami can flood low-lying areas, the aftermath can be even worse. Floodwaters can linger for days, cutting off communities from rescue efforts and leaving them stranded in the path of further destruction. The storm surge caused by the tsunami could also push inland, compounding the damage to coastal infrastructure. The damage to hospitals, power plants, and airports could be catastrophic, leaving communities unable to respond effectively to the disaster. Beyond the immediate destruction, there is the long-term risk of infrastructure collapse. The water supply system in California relies heavily on pipelines that run under the ground. In the event of a powerful earthquake, these pipelines could rupture, leading to widespread water shortages. Without water, the region would be unable to put out fires or provide the necessary care for the injured. Hospitals and clinics, which would be dealing with thousands of casualties, would find themselves unable to function due to power outages and damaged facilities. Another potential hazard is the disruption to communication systems. When a major earthquake hits, cell phone networks and the internet often go down due to overloaded networks and damaged infrastructure. In the case of a tsunami or major quake along the San Andreas Fault, communication breakdowns could prevent residents from receiving critical evacuation instructions or aid. This is particularly concerning in areas where evacuation routes are limited and populations are dense. The earthquake's impact would also disrupt transportation systems. Roads, bridges, and railways that provide access to the coast would likely be destroyed, trapping people in affected areas and making it impossible for emergency responders to get to where they are needed most. Without efficient transportation, evacuations would become even more difficult, and rescue teams would struggle to reach the most vulnerable areas. With all these risks combined, it's clear that a massive earthquake along the San Andreas Fault is not just a threat of shaking, but a multifaceted disaster that could trigger a devastating chain reaction. Tsunamis, fires, infrastructure collapse, and communication breakdowns would all work together to create a perfect storm of destruction. California sits on a ticking time bomb, and when the San Andreas Fault finally snaps, the destruction could be unlike anything we've ever seen. Earthquakes, tsunamis, fires, and infrastructure collapse, all waiting for the perfect moment. The question is not if, but when. So what do you think? Will California ever be truly prepared for the big one? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay ready for what's coming next.